Hello, I have perfected the Darkness 2 on Steam by collecting all 50 achievements. This includes surviving the hit, refusing to cooperate, finishing on the hardest difficulty, and a lot more we'll touch on a bit later. Welcome to my full review. The Darkness 2 is a dark, supernatural, first-person shooter created in 2012, developed by Digital Extremes, and published by 2K. Starting off with the settings, visually, the pulsating darkness in the background is incredibly eerie. I love it, and purple being my favorite color helps it a lot. Now, as you'd expect from an older title, there isn't too many settings to change. However, let's still go over them. Display holds your resolution and basic texture settings. I ran with VSync on to stop the little tearing I was having. Audio has everything nicely separated and even has a voice chat option, which I'll touch more on later. The game options holds your difficulty, which can be changed at any time, and also a few HUD toggles. Now, I left controls for last as I would like to complain about the aim sensitivity. It's pretty bad. What makes it horrible is it changes both your general and ADS sense. They aren't separated, which can sometimes be okay, but in this instance, your general aim goes Mach speed on the lowest setting and forces your ADS to be as slow as a turtle. There is no middle ground or option to fine-tune it, so you're stuck with adapting to its weird difference. That being said, the game was obviously made for controller and feels perfectly fine on one. Quickly touching on the key bindings, the default is okay, but very strange. Again, you can tell controller was the focus as they're using middle mouse as the melee, which is fine until you realize you need to constantly change melee direction. So now you have to press and hold middle mouse while quickly moving your mouse the direction you want. More times than not, you won't get the animation you're wanting anyway. This made melee quite infuriating and unfun to focus on. I also found it weird using backspace as your objective guide, alongside having some of the UI interactable with mouse, and others just simply not. Anyway, if you don't want to deal with any rebinding or having to change your DPIs, simply just plug in a controller. As for the technical side of things, please note I'm running this off a low to high-end PC, so how this performs for me might not perform the same for you. With that being said, the game is an absolute mess on modern systems. I tried to play it years ago and it would never stop crashing. Fast forward to this week, I tried again and the same thing occurred. However, I couldn't make it to the main menu. I cannot for the life of me find any information online until I looked through the Steam guides. An unrated guide by Pob10 figured out how to fix all the problems you may have. Weirdly enough, you have to set the game's affinity in Task Manager to only run off the first 4 cores. 0 to 3, untick the rest. This solved all my crashing issues instantly, so a huge thanks to Pob10. Another issue I had was with the game taking forever to launch, and once up, being greeted with the loudest intro you'll ever hear. I, however, quickly figured out inputting no vid into the launch options solved both of these issues instantly. Now, inside of that and the random tearing, I never had another problem. It ran quite smoothly and overall felt fine. I also didn't encounter any game-breaking bugs outside of a few bodies getting stuck in the walls, which is just general gaming fun. As for the difficulty, there are 4 options: Thug, Mobster, Hitman, and Dawn. You also need to beat the game on Dawn if you're going for a full completion, however it also requires multiple playthroughs, so I recommend playing on a lower difficulty first. The only difference between them is how much you hit and get hit for. It's very generic. That being said, I was disappointed at the Dawn difficulty because it just wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. The hardest part was trying not to rush through to avoid being flanked. If you can hit headshots, the majority of the difficulty is a joke. The bosses thankfully can be a slight challenge, however on the difficulty scale I would rate it at hard. I'm a lover of FPS, so while Dawn wasn't that difficult for me, I know the average player will struggle as there can be a few annoying aspects and the gap of difficulty is drastic enough to spot the difference. As for its replayability, I was pleasantly surprised. You unlock New Game Plus after your first completion, which can be used and also required for missed achievements. There are vendettas, which is a quick continuation of the main story, filling the questions within, and then there are hit lists, which are missions including repeated campaign missions where you must complete X amount to unlock the others. Both of the vendettas and hit lists can be played solo or surprisingly multiplayer up to 4 players. At a quick glance, you'd assume the multiplayer or online co-op tag would be listed here on Steam, however it's not. I learned by simply doing. However, after a longer glance, it does mention it under the key features that I'm sure everyone here reads. As for the gameplay, in short, The Darkness 2 is an arcadic, first-person, story-focused shooter where you play the main character named Jackie, a mafia's don who possesses a power called the Darkness, which provides him supernatural abilities and a pair of demonic arms. The game is a sequel to The Darkness and based off their comic book series under the same name. I think you can tell where the aesthetic comes from. Starting from the very beginning, the tutorial is very well made. It's built right into the storytelling with simple white text and its corresponding bind. If you're not naturally pressing them as they appear, you'll be forced to do so to progress the area. If you're playing on keyboard, this is great as some of the binds are a bit iffy, but the dead stop can make it feel a bit weird. For the most part though, you'll barely notice it, which is always a positive. As for the combat, I was pleasantly surprised at how good it felt. Aside from having to adjust to its fast sensitivity, you're immediately thrown into the gunplay with infinite ammo while being dragged across the floor. You can aim down sights with any weapon, so long as you aren't dual wielding, and each gun has their own recoil to control. The reason I brought up being dragged is for this moment right here. When you're literally on your side, you have to counter that aim. Up is right, down is left, so forth. It was so confusing, yet such a cool mechanic that was sadly never used again. Right after this section, you'll learn guns don't actually have infinite ammo, and you now have tentacle arms to control. These arms will count as yours, be your melee, and also help you open doors. Very cool mechanic. That being said, as mentioned before, the melee on mouse is very weird to get the hang of and can feel incredibly inconsistent and frustrating to get right. Thankfully, your tentacles are there for so much more, such as grabbing and throwing objects, including humans, and then brutally ripping their bodies apart to drink their blood for dark essence and your chosen buff. Oh, I might have forgot to mention, this game is quite gory and was rated M for mature and not suitable for all audiences. Now that's out of the way, I don't think anyone will have a hard time feeling like a badass. I loved every second and never once got tired of the combat. Oh, and if the name didn't already give it away, you're deeply scared of the light, which is a big problem, because every time you step within one, you're immediately flashbanged. Thankfully, you can just steal yourself a gun and shoot the lights off directly, or its generator attached. Going back to the Dark Essence, that is the currency of the game that allows you to pick up talents from this dark mist found within the levels. Depending on the character you're playing will also determine how many upgrades are available. I'll touch more on that later. However, the skill trees are nice and simple to understand, providing an extra layer of depth with new skill and passive unlocks, all of which makes you stronger with no disadvantage. You have the freedom to go down any path you wish, just so long you have the essence. Now, my only complaint with the skill tree, outside of the poor controls, comes with it being impossible to complete in a single playthrough. I found it quite lame not having the capability to max out my character's potential before the main game is over. Interesting take, and I understand the reason is for replayability, and that's cool and all for higher difficulties, but I'm just not a fan of that. Outside of that, overall I think they pretty much nailed it. I would prefer to see this style of tree in modern titles. Each node provides something new and useful outside of just a 0.3 increase and 1% decrease to a stat. Each their own though. Now before I touch on the boss fights, let's talk about the game modes. The one I've been talking about the most has been the main story, which is obviously the bread and butter holding the main experience together. Once you complete the game and the credits roll, you unlock New Game Plus. This will keep all your talent progress and allow you to replay the entire game and or select specific chapters to go through for missed relics or essence. You're also given the option to play Vendettas, which are an online cooperative expansion of the base game with the story running parallel with the main game through an even quicker campaign. It can also be completed solo. However, you're then given the option to pick between one of 4 new characters around this table and become them, which I thought was a really cool idea for a lobby. The menus here do suck to traverse like the majority on keyboard, however just use your arrow keys. This mode is needed for a full completion, so I played through all of them with my friend Void, and we were pleasantly surprised at how difficult it was compared to the base game. There were a few times it almost felt unfair, as we'd get randomly one-tapped or completely surrounded by heavily armored mobs. It was truly a fun and different time. The one thing that bothered me about it though was the final boss, but I'll touch on him soon. Following the vendettas, you have hit lists. These are replayable missions similar to the campaign, but with each being played individually. There are 18 hit lists split across 3 locations. Some of the missions are available immediately, while others must be unlocked through the Vendetta campaign or completing other hit list missions, some of which requiring a minimum of 2 players. Overall, I thought the multiplayer modes were a blast and added to the experience. While I don't completely agree with locking certain missions behind a player requirement, you don't need to play them all for achievement completion anyway. As for the bosses, to keep it short, they're all pretty okay. There is nothing too extraordinary about them, and playing on higher difficulties, the only thing I notice is they're a bit prolonged with more health and damage, but that's pretty normal. The first boss you fight is by far the most interesting compared to the rest. He sits tucked away in his little wrecking ball excavator, trying to swing you down while your friend finds propane tanks you'll use to throw at him. I thought this was pretty cool and it had me excited to see the rest. However, to my disappointment, the remaining bosses are all pretty much the same. You meet them in their own private area and then chase them around the room, blasting them with bullets, sometimes dodging, sometimes murdering waves. It's very generic, and while that's perfectly fine, the first boss just made me expect a little more. The final boss fight was also just that. After you defeat him, you're thrown into a wave after wave until the game is over. Ta-da, you did it. Woo. I think what made me even more upset is once you start doing the vendettas, the final boss of that campaign is a literal hell-beasted dragon that can one-shot you with its insanely pretty mechanics. Yes, it still has some of the generic mechanics thrown in, but this felt like a proper boss fight and not just a toy ring with my lost cousin wanting to murder me for eating his lost chicken nugget. I just think some of the bosses felt a little rushed or could have had a little more thought put into them. That's all. Moving into the wonderful world of Darkness 2. Visually, it's stunning, and they did an outstanding job perfecting the comic book style aesthetic they were pushing for. It's not in your face, hard to look at, or full of annoying text bubbles. The world themselves are all split up into chapters with each unlocking a new environment, with the exception of the multiplayer modes as they reuse many locations but also provide a few new. The entire game is incredibly linear and holds your hand with great strength. That being said, some of the worlds become quite large, giving you the immersion of a greater open world, however still funnels you exactly where it wants you to go. On the bright side, you won't ever get lost. Even when looking for relics, they're all typically found close by, hidden behind an item or in a room you'll most likely walk into anyway. There's only one relic in the entire game that can be missed by simply just not adventuring backwards. I very much prefer solo campaigns to be this way, and while I think the collectibles could have been a lot more hidden, they did an amazing job all around with it. As for traveling, the entire game is played with boots on ground if you ignore being dragged in the tutorial. Not having a single driving section in a Mafia-related game was a little weird to me, but I won't deduct points as it felt good as is. Moving into the audio, for the most part, they did a great job with it, and I don't think anyone will have trouble becoming immersed. I was fully into it my entire way through. Most of the background tracks are very well placed, with some even fueling your madness. There is some copyrighted music randomly placed throughout, usually during cutscenes and radios, so I suppose that is your small warning if you plan to record the game, as there is obviously no option to disable them, as streamer mode wasn't really a thing back then. The only negative I have is the spatial awareness is pretty bad, especially when it comes to verticality. You can usually tell the general direction of where the enemy is, but their movement is sometimes masked or not obvious in the slightest. There were times I wouldn't hear an enemy literally standing behind me, or I'd hear them run right beside me, but they're upstairs in a different room. It can be very confusing at times. Hey, you've been to the story section and my thoughts on it. I won't be covering the spoilers in depth, but if you would like to avoid them, skip ahead to the positive and negative section below. Ready? Okay. You play as Jackie Estacado, who becomes the Dawn of the Franchetti family and over the years learned to contain the ancient demonic darkness within him, with the help of his occultist expert Johnny Powell, only for those supernatural powers to now want out for blood. Living the mafia life, you're being hunted by a mysterious brotherhood who will stop for nothing to obtain the darkness for themselves. You constantly switch between reality, questioning your sanity, all while constantly being haunted by the memory of your murdered girlfriend. Now, the storytelling overall is pretty decent. The parts of the story that speak to me the most are all the moments between Jackie and Jenny. The romantic side of the story is very well made and quite tragic. I felt like I could really relate to these two in some way or another. Almost all the characters feel like they play an actual part as you slowly get to know why they're doing what they're doing. While I might not agree with their boss fights, their story is pretty okay. Now, I thought connecting the main story with the vendettas was a really interesting and fitting thing, though I wish it expanded the end just a bit more with how it played out. There are technically two endings you can do, one where you stay with Jenny forever, which is wholesome yet really not tied to any achievement, while the other is an insanely sexy cliffhanger for a third game that never happened. Very bothersome. It doesn't help that the vendettas only answer questions you'd have with the main story outside of the ending. It is very clear that Darkness 3 was supposed to come sometime after, but the fact we've yet to see it, someone get on it. I wouldn't consider this story a masterpiece, but it kept my attention most of the way through, has great pacing, and is short enough to not overstay its welcome. A modernized Darkness could be actually really good. My main complaint with the story comes down to its ending. However, gameplay-wise, the ability to skip dialogue in cutscenes is quite infuriating. They're very mixed and seems inconsistent on what's allowed to be skipped. Some long parts you'd expect to skip, you're not allowed, yet they will allow more important text and story-defining parts to be skipped. Makes no sense. It's fine to sit through all dialogue and cutscenes on a first playthrough, however once New Game Plus is unlocked, you should be able to skip anything and everything you wish. Allowing some but not all is just a really weird way to do it. As mentioned before, there are a total of 50 achievements, all of which took me 15 hours to obtain, with a single playthrough taking around 5. I will not be mentioning the ones handed to you just by playing, however let's start with the more missable ones, such as Karma's a Bitch, where you must kill a shielded enemy with their own shield. I actually had to go out of my way for this one as I just never thought to do so. Decisions is refusing to cooperate with Victor in the interrogation. Simply just put your mouse down and you'll be good. I love that this was an option because I hate when it's not in other games. Romantic is to simply dance with Jenny at the restaurant for however long it takes. A quick honorable mention is you've made my hit list. It's ranked as the hardest achievement in Steam, and all you have to do is complete 6 hit list exclusive missions. These are so quick, but just goes to show no one knew it was multiplayer or cared about them in the slightest. Now my hardest achievement award will be going to Suck It Up, where you must defeat 50 people with the black hole in the main campaign. The difficulty of this one comes down to pure luck. Not only do you have to obtain the ability in your skill tree, it's just a chance a black hole heart will drop off one of the guys you defeat, and then you need enemies around to use it on. Stepping in the light will also automatically drop it where you're standing. This was the least fun grind of the entire game. Anyway, now let's go over some of the positives. The combat is quite diverse and a blast to play around with. The visual aesthetic is timeless, making it a nice treat to play whenever. There's a lot of replayability, and even a multiplayer mode to mess around with. As for the negatives, it has a lot of modern system issues that need to be fixed prior to playing. The controls can be miserable if not playing on a controller, and the story ends on a never-continued cliffhanger. In conclusion, The Darkness 2 is a mature, supernatural, first-person shooter created in 2012 about a mafia don and his lost girlfriend, but would I recommend it? Well, The Darkness 2 is currently available for 30 Canadian doll hairs or your regional equivalent on the Steam and Xbox storefronts, with physical editions available for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 3, currently costing about half or double that depending where you look. Now while this game is entirely up my alley with the dark and mafia themes, it being from 2012, I don't think $30 is entirely fair. I'd highly recommend waiting for a sale, as I know it drops down to about 5 or less. I could justify paying 10 to 15 for this experience, but that extra 20 just throws me off. If you're looking for a unique comic book styled shooter, I couldn't recommend this game enough. I had a blast perfecting it, and even with its imperfections, I never wanted to put it down. The Darkness 2. 4 out of 6. Thank you for watching if you made it this far. Let me know your thoughts down below, or what game I should complete next. Subscribe so you never miss a video, and until next time, take care.